So we've been talking about Philemon, but you mentioned also Philippians as a parallel text or a conversation text with Philippians. Tell us about Philippians. How do we read this letter?
Yeah, there are definitely parallels between the two letters in some significant ways. Maybe if I have time too, I can come back to John Chrysostom on that. But when we read the book of Philippians, we have to recognize that there are two really important key words. The first one is koinonia. I mentioned that as you can translate as partnership, fellowship, um, participation, solidarity. You get two instances at the beginning of the letter, two instances at the end, and then you have 1 and 2:1, and then 1 and 3:10. So you've got it's bookending the letter. It's all focused on partnership and gospel advancement, fellowship in grace, fellowship in the sufferings of Christ. So that's a key word. And the other one is a Greek word, phroneo, which means a way of thinking, feeling, and acting. Oftentimes, the English just translates it think, as if it's a merely intellectual endeavor. Have this, or they translate it mind. So in Philippians 2:5, have this mind, which is yours also in Christ Jesus. But it's anything but a purely intellectual exercise. It's a way of thinking, feeling, and acting. And if you looked at how the word is used in other places within the letter, you'd be able to note that. So those two words give us a sort of entryway into the deeper structure of the book of Philippians. And I think you can pretty much sum that up as Philippians 2, 6 through 11 as the core of the entire letter, as the radiating center. And if I often say, if I preach through the whole book of Philippians, which I probably will someday, I will start with 2, 5 through 11. Everything kind of emanates from there. But you definitely see a conceptual structure, conceptual connections with other parts. So, for example, when you read 2, 5 through 11, there's always the debate. Is this just a redemptive historical, survey of what Christ did? He was humiliated in his humiliation and his exaltation, right? So he did not grasp on or hold on to the glory that he had, but he emptied himself by taking on the form of a servant and so forth, and then God exalted him. Is it just laying out a moment in redemptive history, or is this a model for us to imitate? Is he just saying, here's Jesus, and this is how he loved people, and this is how you ought to love people? Well, that dichotomy is false. Both are true, but you need to understand it through union with Christ. So in chapter 2, verse 5, he says, have this way of thinking, feeling, and acting which is also in Christ Jesus. And I would translate that not just in the historical person, but in union with Jesus Christ. We have this way of thinking, feeling, and acting. Well, in 2:5, the word this points back to 2:1 to 4. And it's humility toward one another. It's unity in the body. These are the ways that we think, feel, and act like Christ. But it stems from union with Jesus Christ, which happens by faith. Now, you see that even in the leaders in Philippians. So, for example, Paul says, I really wanted to be with Christ, for it meant deeper communion, but it's more advantageous that I stay with you, right? So that I can minister among you. So he has a somewhat of a right that he lets go for the sake of others. Well, he right there would be what Luther calls a second Christ or another Christ. He's thinking, feeling, and living like Christ would in 2, 5 through 11. And then if you jump over to chapter 2, you get a description of Timothy. How does Paul describe him? Well, in chapter 1, verse 1, he called him a doulos. He's a slave, or they're douloi, they're slaves. And then in chapter 2, um, verses 21, 22, he says that he serves in the gospel, and he uses the Greek word deluo, which is related to being a slave. And so Timothy is a kind of Christ, to use Luther's language, not being Christ, creator creature distinction, right? But a kind of Christ. And then you have lastly Epaphroditus, who risked his life even to the point of death. And the Greek word there, the Greek phrase is mekri thanatu, to the point of death. And you know where that's found because you've written an article on that. So that's 2:8, right? In Philippians.
Add to eight, yeah.
So he was obedient even to the point of death. So Paul intentionally takes the language of 2:6 through 11 and maps it on to these leaders in Philippians to show through our union with Christ, we not only believe in him, but we become conformed into his image. And so it really does change the way you read the letter.